Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive.
From AI-inspired insights from farmers.
If you're enjoying what we're doing here, we'd love to hear from you too.
Absolutely.
Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and definitely leave a comment telling us what you want to see more of on this deep dive.
We're always looking for new ideas, and we really value your feedback.
So what farm-related mysteries are you dying to uncover?
Right.
What questions are keeping you up at night? Let us know, and maybe we'll tackle them in a future deep dive. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really critical issue for anyone in farming or even thinking about it: the impact of inflation.
That's right. You shared some great sources, and we're going to, break down how these rising prices are hitting farmers.
Exactly. And also look at some potential, practical solutions based on that material.
Mhm.
Our goal is to give you a clear picture of the challenges and maybe some ways forward without it being too overwhelming.
Precisely. And the sources, they really detail the struggles, the specific ways inflation hits costs and income, and even the bigger economic picture, from groceries right down to farm inputs.
And that's so relevant if you're newer to farming or maybe considering it. Understanding these economic headwinds like inflation, it's just vital for setting realistic
Yeah,
expectations.
making good decisions, yeah.
So this deep dive should equip you with a better handle on the current agricultural economy and maybe some strategies to navigate it. Okay, let's start with the basics then. What exactly are we talking about with inflation here?
So fundamentally, inflation is the general increase in prices for goods and services over a period of time.
Right.
One of the sources used a good example, actually, with eggs and ground beef, showing how the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, tracks those changes for a typical shopper.
And that general rise in prices, it hits farmers in, a couple of ways, doesn't it? Your sources point out they're producers, but also consumers.
Exactly. They feel it from both sides. So
Okay.
let's look at the producer side first.
Okay.
As producers, inflation directly hikes up the costs of pretty much everything they need to run the farm. The sources mention specifics like seeds, obviously fundamental.
Starting point for everything.
Yeah. And then fertilizers. That was a big one. One source noted some farmers saw, a 300% increase in urea prices back in 2022?
Wow, 300%. That's huge. And you mentioned it was linked to specific supply chain issues.
Yeah, disruptions in key exporting countries. So not just a general rise, but specific global pressures affecting that input dramatically.
And it's not just fertilizer, is it?
Oh no, pesticides too, for crop protection. Then you've got fuel for tractors and equipment, which, swings wildly with global energy prices.
Always seems to be going up.
Right. And feed for livestock, another major expense hit hard. Utilities, electricity, water on the farm, those costs are up too. Even just repairing equipment costs more now.
So it's really across the board for inputs. But you said they're also consumers. How does inflation hit their personal bottom line?
Well, it erodes their purchasing power, plain and simple. When the cost of living, groceries, housing, everything goes up faster than their farm income, it gets tougher to afford necessities.
Makes sense.
And it leaves less money for saving or, crucially, reinvesting back into the farm itself. So it impacts their standard of living and the farm's future.
So higher costs to run the farm, higher personal costs, and income maybe not keeping up. That sounds like a real squeeze.
It is. And on top of that, inflation creates a lot of uncertainty in the market itself.
How so?
Well, it leads to price volatility for what they sell: crops, livestock. It becomes really hard to plan ahead. How do you make investment decisions, say on new machinery, when you can't reliably predict your returns because prices are bouncing around?
Yeah, one source mentioned that tricky dynamic where maybe input costs force farmers to produce less, which could push prices up.
Right, supply and demand?
But then
Yeah.
maybe overall sales dropped if consumers can't afford those higher prices. It sounds like walking a tightrope.
It really is. And then there's the whole issue of debt.
Ah, yes. Farming often involves loans, right?
Very often.
Yeah.
For land, equipment, operating costs, inflation makes paying back those loans harder in real terms.
Because the money they earn buys less, even if the loan payment amount stays the same.
Exactly. It eats up a bigger chunk of their actual spending power. And then the tool often used to fight inflation, raising interest rates.
Which we've seen happening.
Right. That makes borrowing more expensive. So managing existing debt gets tougher. And taking out new loans for needed investments becomes much harder too.
Okay, so we've got the direct impacts: costs, income, uncertainty, debt. Let's zoom out a bit to the broader economic insights from your sources. You mentioned CPI earlier, but there's also PPI.
Yes. the Producer Price Index.
Yeah.
So CPI measures inflation for consumers, what we pay at the store. PPI looks at it from the producer's side, the costs for manufacturers and, well, farmers.
Okay, so why is understanding both important for farmer?
Well, if you see the PPI for farm inputs rising faster than the CPI for food, that's a warning sign. It suggests your costs are climbing quicker than the prices you might get, potentially squeezing your margins. Watching those trends can help with, purchasing and pricing decisions.
That's a practical takeaway. The sources also pointed to some root causes of this recent inflation, particularly the pandemic.
Oh, absolutely. The pandemic caused massive supply chain disruptions globally. Then, when demand picked up after lockdowns eased, suppliers struggled to keep up, especially with labor shortages.
And that pushed prices up everywhere.
Pretty much, yeah. Limited supply, high demand, classic inflation trigger. Agriculture was definitely affected.
And it wasn't just the pandemic itself, right? Other global events played a role.
For sure. Things like government relief packages, which injected money into economies, and then major geopolitical events like the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
How did that affect things?
Well, it further strained supply chains, disrupted trade, and specifically drove up prices for key commodities like wheat and fertilizer, since both those countries are huge exporters.
Right, impacting fertilizer costs again. Now, about commodity prices themselves, the prices farmers get. High prices sound good, but the sources suggested it's more complicated.
It is more nuanced, yes. Higher prices for their crops or livestock can help offset some rising costs, which is good,
Right.
but it can also create a bit of a feedback loop. High commodity prices can actually increase demand for farm inputs like fertilizer or seed, potentially keeping those input prices high.
Ah, I see.
And another point, very high domestic prices can sometimes make U.S. exports less competitive globally. Buyers might look elsewhere if our prices are too high compared to other countries.
So it's a double-edged sword, potentially. What about assets, like farmland? How does inflation affect that?
Inflation often leads to asset appreciation, and farmland is a prime example. Land values can go up.
Which sounds good if you own the land.
It can be, yes. It increases your net worth on paper. But for farmers who rent their land, rising land values are usually bad news.
Because rents go up.
Exactly. It makes it harder for tenant farmers to stay profitable. So the impact really depends if you're an owner or a renter. That's a key distinction.
That's a very important point. Did the sources offer any maybe positive news on the inflation front recently?
Yes, one did note that inflation rates have started to cool down a bit. The rate in 2023 was lower than the peak in 2022, for instance.
So maybe some easing of the pressure.
Potentially. It offers a slightly more optimistic outlook than, say, a year or two ago, but, caution is still needed.
Okay, so we've defined it, looked at the impacts, the economic drivers. Let's focus now on the real-world effects this has on actual farms and farmers.
Well, on the farm itself, a big one is decision-making. When input costs are sky high, farmers might have to make tough calls.
Like cutting back on things.
Exactly. Maybe using less fertilizer or fewer pesticides, or skipping some practices that could boost yield or quality just because they can't afford it. And that, unfortunately, can hurt their output in the end.
And we mentioned exports earlier. That's a real-world impact too, right? Competitiveness.
Definitely. If U.S. commodity prices stay high due to domestic inflation, our exports can lose market share. International buyers might just go somewhere cheaper. That affects demand for U.S. farm products.
So adding it all up, higher costs, uncertain prices, maybe debt issues, it sounds like significant financial strain.
It really is, and that strain can be especially tough for new farmers.
Why, particularly new farmers?
They often have less capital built up, fewer reserves to cushion against these rising costs. They might also be more reliant on loans to get started. So this kind of environment is particularly challenging if you're just trying to get established.
And related to that, though maybe not directly inflation, one source touched on land access, which is a huge issue for new farmers anyway.
That's right. The broader economic picture, including land prices appreciating partly due to inflation, partly other factors, just makes it harder and more expensive for new folks to actually get access to land to farm, whether buying or renting.
Okay, so looking forward then, what's the general outlook? Does this pressure ease off or?
Well, even with inflation cooling somewhat, the agricultural sector is likely to stay pretty sensitive to economic ups and downs.
So still volatile.
Probably. Global events, supply chain issues aren't going away overnight, consumer demand shifts. All these things mean continued uncertainty is likely.
Which means adaptability is key.
Absolutely crucial. Farmers will need to stay flexible, keep adapting, and find strategies to manage these ongoing economic changes and inflationary pressures.
Okay, that brings us perfectly to our bonus insight section. Based on the solutions hinted at in the sources, what practical steps can farmers take, especially newer ones, and what policy changes might help ease this burden?
Yeah, there are definitely things farmers can do and things that could happen at a policy level. For individual farmers, diversification is a big one mentioned.
Meaning, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Essentially, yes. Growing a mix of crops, maybe raising different types of livestock, it reduces your risk if the price of one particular commodity tanks due to inflation or other market swings. It's basic risk management.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
What else on the farm level?
Focusing on efficiency, really honing in on getting the most out of every input.
How?
Things like using precision agriculture techniques, optimizing water or energy use, adopting technology to cut waste and boost productivity. If you can produce more with less, or the same amount with less, that helps offset those higher input costs.
And financially, what should farmers be doing?
Strong financial literacy and planning are just non-negotiable. Building up emergency funds is vital. Managing debt very carefully. And maybe exploring tools like hedging. Some sources mention that. It's where you try to lock in prices for your crops or inputs in advance, using contracts or financial tools to reduce that price risk. It's complex, but can be useful.
Okay. Contract farming also came up. How does that fit in?
Setting up contracts directly with agribusinesses like processors or retailers, that can sometimes provide more stable markets and guaranteed prices, reducing that uncertainty from volatile markets.
Good point. And what about just staying informed and connected?
Definitely. Engaging with rural development programs, taking training courses, learning new skills, it all helps farmers adapt and stay current with best practices for dealing with these economic shifts.
Those are really solid, actionable tips for farmers. Now, what about the bigger picture policy changes? What kind of government actions could make a difference?
Government support can be really important. Things like targeted subsidies for essential inputs like fuel or fertilizer to directly counteract those rising costs.
So, direct financial help.
Yes, or things like price stabilization mechanisms to smooth out some of the wild market swings, and robust safety net programs to protect farm incomes when inflation causes major dips.
What about infrastructure? Does that play a role?
A huge role. Investing in rural infrastructure, better roads, storage, broadband access that can lower farmers' operating costs and improve their ability to get products to market efficiently.
And given the debt issues we discussed, anything on the lending side?
Policies promoting fair lending practices are key. And providing support for farmers who are really struggling with debt made worse by inflation, maybe loan restructuring options, access to affordable credit, financial counseling.
Lastly, the sources mentioned policy support for diversification and efficiency, mirroring the advice for farmers.
Exactly. Government programs could actively fund and promote efforts by farmers to diversify their operations, maybe trying new crops, value-added products like jams or cheeses.
Right, moving up the value chain.
Yeah. And also supporting the adoption of those efficiency-boosting technologies and sustainable practices we talked about through research funding or cost-sharing programs, that helps the whole sector become more resilient.
That's a really comprehensive look at both farm-level actions and potential policy levers. So let's try and wrap up the key takeaways from our deep dive today.
Sure. I think the main thing is that inflation creates significant hurdles for farmers, higher input costs, less purchasing power, market uncertainty, debt pressure. It's a complex web.
But not insurmountable.
No, definitely not. Proactive strategies, both on the farm and through supportive policies, can make a real difference. Things like diversification, boosting efficiency, smart financial planning, and well-designed government support are all crucial pieces of the puzzle for navigating this landscape.
Okay, and that leads us to our final provocative thought for listeners to chew on. Considering all these pressures and the potential solutions we've discussed, what kind of innovative collaborations, maybe community-based efforts, could further empower new farmers, specifically helping them build resilient, sustainable farms despite this economic uncertainty?
That's a great question. It really highlights that this is a complex issue with many layers.
Absolutely. And your continued learning and engagement are going to be vital in shaping agriculture's future. Thanks for joining us for this in-depth exploration today. Hitting that like button and smash that subscribe.